myself and Future of the Left, and then introduce Andy. Gillian Tett, I think, is probably in a taxi now, somewhere between King's Cross and here. So she's going to be a bit late. Anyway, my name's Jonathan Rutherford. I'm the organiser of the Future of the Left, which was set up in Policy Exchange, and the aim of it is to think about the political narrative of this Labour government, to try and help it work out what its purpose is, and its kind of its political aim, and it's the story it wants to tell about the country. And in the process of doing that, to think about the illustrative policies and what are the priority areas. So we've divided the work up into political economy, the idea of a social covenant, and national security and foreign policy, and they're all interrelated in the sense that you can't have national security and economic security without restoring popular confidence in our democracy. Anyway, so today I'd like to introduce Andy, who's going to talk about the political economy side of the work we're doing, and talk about the sort of, what's happening in the economy at the moment, and what he thinks the government needs to do and what it needs to address. So I think most of you will know Andy. He was the chief economist at the Bank of England. He's now CEO at Royal Society of the Arts. But for me, I was sort of introduced to Andy by his speeches at the Bank of England, which I thought were always incredibly well done, good communication of what is for a lot of people a very tricky, difficult subject. And that's how I kind of came to know Andy, through the kind of way he's popularised economics. And then later, when I was working for various Labour politicians, we would meet, we'd talk about levelling up or the everyday economy or something. He was always hugely supportive and helpful. So anyway, I won't say any more, but I'll just hand you over to Andy, and Gillian will be turning up at some point. So, okay, thank you.
Well, thank you, Jonathan, for that kind intro. Afternoon, everyone. Nice to see you all. I was going to thank Gillian, but not yet. She's always reliably 10 to 15 minutes late, so this is right on cue, actually. She'll meander, and I'll just put my little red book down here. Can you all see the slides? Okay. Can you see them on that screen? Yeah. I'm going to navigate through a few slides with apologies. And the topic is, as the title suggests, how to deliver inclusive growth, question mark. So the question mark is deliberate. I'm not coming today bearing answers, all the answers to that big question, but I hope to sketch some of the contours of what a meaningful answer is to that question, of not just growth, but growth that is felt by everyone, that is truly inclusive. Although my tie is shocking, pink, nothing I'll say will be shocking, I don't think, today. I hope it follows fairly naturally from a shared diagnosis of the places where the UK is doing well and less well, and hopefully a shared prescription of what might be done. And to be clear, I think more at a larger scale will be needed to be done to lift the growth malaise the UK has faced over the last at least 20 years, I would say. So I will be at least impliedly, and sometimes explicitly, just a tad critical of what's been done governmentally, not just the current government, but its predecessors, because many of those fault lines are of long standing. So next slide, please. Here's a rough plan of action, the ground I'll try and cover in about half an hour, by which time I hope Gillian's turned up. So I'll start with what do we even mean by inclusive growth. That's going to be nested in the notion of opportunity and how best to furnish that opportunity for the widest number of people. I'll touch upon the fact that for many people, that what I've called the opportunity escalator has got gummed up or stalled, and indeed why that might be, which goes to a lack of scale in how we've gone about tackling it, and a lack of systems thinking in the re-engineering of our various systems. But I want to end with 3 dimensions of public policy where I thought more will need to be done and in some cases different stuff, will need to be done to achieve this inclusive growth goal. And that's around industrial strategy, around governance, particularly at the local level, if you like, the levelling up agenda. And thirdly, around institutions. What is the new ecology of institutions and infrastructures we might need to make good on this inclusive growth objective? And then we'll cast us open to, I hope, a conversation in the room about those three things, and doubtless a few more besides. So next slide, please. What do I mean then by inclusive growth? Well, there's been commissions galore on this very topic, but the definition I will use, as I mentioned a second ago, is one nested in opportunity for everyone, everywhere. We cannot level the playing field when it comes to outcomes in society, and probably shouldn't. But we can when it comes to opportunities, irrespective of which sector you work in, irrespective of whether you are rich or poor, irrespective of where in the country you choose to live. And what the research shows very clearly is when it comes to individual agency, when it comes to individual well-being, it is the gradient of income that matters every bit as much or more as its starting level when lifting lives. That is to say, providing the floor, if you like, the Chancellor's Scuronomics, is a necessary condition for progress, but far from being a sufficient one. That speaks to opportunity as well as security. That speaks to a ladder, or indeed an escalator, as much as it does a floor. And among the reasons right now why growth is stalled is because that sense of escalator, that sense of ladder, has been removed for a great many people. Many metrics of generational progress, for example, social mobility, have gummed up. In the US, this often takes the form of the debate about death of the American dream, or in the limiting case, the deaths of despair felt by parts of Rust Belt middle America. Close to home, here in the UK, as you all know, the government has its 5 missions. Primus inter pares among those is the growth mission. Were it me, I would say that a different mission, namely the opportunity mission, is foundational to that growth mission. If individuals are not progressing, how can communities progress? If communities are not progressing, how can a national economy progress? So for me, the essence of the inclusive growth agenda is about opening up those opportunities for all to climb the ladder, to rise on the escalator. Next slide, please. And the truth is that for a great many people right now, too many people, that is not the case. The escalator is stalled. For some, it's a down escalator, not even a travelator. It's a down escalator. And some of the facts here, which I won't go through in huge detail or depth, speak to that, starting in the earliest of years, starting in schools, where the diagnostics, the stats, for example, around those excluded from the education system at the earliest of years are rising at a scandalously rapid rate, and are now a frighteningly large number. Perhaps 1 in 10 kids now, either formally or informally, excluded from the education system. That's among the reasons why we find among poorer kids around a third at the age of 18 have left education and learning, most likely on a lifelong basis. They leave our education system with the worst possible endowment imaginable. That is to say, a loathing of learning. And if, of course, you loathe learning, you're far less likely to engage in learning on a lifelong basis. And that is the plight of perhaps a third of young people today. One rung up the ladder. At the point people enter the world of work, and the issue goes from schools to skills, we see some of those self-same blights. It manifests itself in the 9.5 million almost people of working age who are neither seeking work nor seeking training right now, including, and perhaps most worryingly of all, the more than 1 million aged between 18 to 24. This is hidden unemployment in all bar name. Doesn't count in the unemployment stats because people are seeking work, but nonetheless is in all important respects. Layer on top of that 9.5 million inactive, the more than 10 million in the workforce, but without the skills they need to do their job productively. That number is doubtless rising fast, not least given how little we are doing by way of investing in the skills of our workforce. Some numbers here of the extent to which both public and private investment in people, in their skills, is off a quarter from 15 years ago and sits fully a third below the EU average. We are not, for all our rhetoric, investing in people and their skills, and that's among the reasons blighting their lives and our national economy. It's among the reasons, when you turn to the world of work, why we see stasis in real median pay, and have done for the larger part of the last 15 years. Where productivity leads, pay follows. Productivity's flatlined, importantly because of skills deficits, and that in turn has shown up in stasis in pay. As Resolution Foundation pointed out just last week after the spring statement, on their estimates, this will be the second parliament running in which the poorest half of the population will end the parliament poorer than when they commence. So back-to-back parliaments with the poorest somewhat poorer. And that's before we even get to issues of precarity in work, the hours counterpart to pay, if you like. Staple those things together along the opportunity escalator, and you get, unsurprisingly, a picture of social mobility stalled. Comparing this generation with their parents or grandparents, this generation are running well behind on income. They're running even further behind on metrics such as home ownership. And in that sense, the opportunity escalator is stalled for a great many, breaking a generational norm, a social norm that's been with us since at least the Industrial Revolution. And that's why it bites hard, not least into young persons' well-being. Here's a little picture, actually. It's a different than usual metric of social mobility, a map of social mobility across the UK. Think of the warmer colours as signalling a stalling or retreat in levels of social mobility, parent to child. You'll see where the red zones are, no surprise where they reside, but that, I think, brings home the extent to which there has been breach of a well-established generational social norm. Next slide, please. If you ask the question then of why, I'm going to come to what might be done, but how is it this has happened? What what have been the reasons why we find ourselves in this sticky spot? Well, for me, at root, this is about scale or lack thereof, and about systems thinking, or the lack thereof, when tackling the problems I'm going to talk about. We have not lacked in this country for policy initiatives. They've come thick and fast over the decades. Many of them have been directionally sensible. But most of them have also fallen well short of the scale needed to close the gaps, to make a material difference. If I think back even to last week's spring statement, it was, again, a diet and menu largely of lowish ticket initiatives, which the best will in the world will not move the dial. Let me give you just one or two examples of that problem of subscale action and lack of systems thinking. One is in the area of investment. If we are to supercharge growth, every economist would tell you that that's hard to do without investing, without boosting the capital stock. The surest fire way of getting growth going is to invest and grow the capital stock, the machines, the plants, the technologies that drive productivity and therefore growth. On that basis, the starting point is not as we would wish. Our capital stock in the UK per worker is about half that. Here's Gillian. The timing could scarcely be better, Gillian. My previous sentence, which I'll repeat for your benefit and only your benefit, is... Come up here, so we can check you don't leave again. The UK capital stock, Gillian. Everyone else has heard this.
Okay,
for your benefit.
I've read your presentation several times, but carry on.
I'll test
you on it.
Well, in that case, if you've read it, then I'll not repeat it. And what's true internationally is true spatially in terms of levels of investment in different capital stocks in different parts of the country. Scandalous differences in capital stocks between London and the rest of the country. The reason for that should come as no secret to anyone. It's the fruits of having underinvested for at least 30 years and invested at scale for at least 30 years. And that's true by international comparison. It's true by spatial comparison. So it's the fruits of too little investment for too long that results in the capital stock that matters most being subscale. Now, here's the good news. It's qualified good news, which is that you'll have seen in last year's budget that Rachel began to repair some of the damage. She tweaked her fiscal rules to enable her to spend a cumulative extra £100 billion over 5 years publicly. That's the good news. Here comes the less good news. All that did was to stabilise the public investment to GDP ratio. That investment remains materially below most other nation states in the OECD, which means that even with that chunky increment, the gap in capital stocks between the UK and the rest of the world is widening, not narrowing over time, without which it's hard to see us playing a game of growth catch-up with those countries. A couple more quick examples. Next slide, please. Which I'll do more en passant, but an example of a lack of system thinking and scale. This is a quite topical one, a recent one. We all know that growth also depends on the stock of human capital, stock of physical capital, stock of human capital. And internationally, on that front, we fare better than we do on the physical capital front. But nonetheless, we have still a story of disparity, of difference, that calls, I would say, for a serious re-engineering of our education system for, let's call it, the third of young people who are currently being left behind. Now, the good news here, again, is that the government put in place a review of the curriculum run by Becky Francis at its outset, the interim report from which came out just last week. I've plucked 2 quotes from that report, which, when I read them, filled me with horror and dread. Here they are. I'll not read them out, but they do not exude a strong sense of system shifting being on the agenda. They talk of balance and caution and the existing system working pretty well. And that is not the lived experience, I think, of a great many young people right now. No system response, no scale. There's a whole bunch of fascinating things that could be done, imaginative things that could be done. I mentioned 1 or 2 of them here. Thinking differently about how we score school success, thinking differently about how we teach, as well as what we teach. I hope that they might remain in scope, but so far it hasn't been so good. Final example before I move on to what might be done. Next slide, please. Again, a topical one, welfare reform, or welfare to work reform. We all know that growth also depends upon how many people are in the workforce. And on that front, unemployment is low. That is masking this hidden unemployment in the form of labour market inactivity. And a significant contributor to that is our benefit system, which rewards not seeking work and not seeking training versus seeking work and seeking training. What a crazy system to have designed. And the good news from last week or the week before was when Liz Kendall spoke about reconfiguring this system to make job search and training pay. So, more search doesn't, though, necessarily mean more work. It's not just seeking, but finding work that matters. And we know that the characteristics of those currently inactive are often not conducive to finding a job very quickly or very easily. Their needs include flexibility in work, occupational health in work, reskilling in work, currently on offer by very few businesses. The government announced an extra £1 billion to enable some of that employment support. But listen, we're talking about almost 10 million people. £1 billion doesn't touch the sides of helping them back into the world of work. Contrast that, earlier in the week, the government announced 660 million to train 60,000 construction workers, roughly 10 grand a pop. This, for the inactive, who find it even harder to enter the world of work, it's a tiny fraction of that, in which case we'll not have had a system reconfiguration of welfare into work. We instead will have a configuration of welfare into slightly less welfare. In other words, an income cut, a benefits cut for the 3 million plus involved. So far, so bad. What might be done and what might be done differently? Let me now explore those 3 dimensions: industrial strategy, governance, and institutions, and how they might be reconfigured to achieve this holy grail of inclusive growth. So next slide, please. Starting with this, an industrial strategy. First thing to say here is the new government has one, and not for the first time. Actually, for those that say we haven't had industrial strategy in this country, in fact, we've had loads. We've had industrial strategies galore over the last 70 years. And of course, therein lies part of the problem. They have come and they have gone. They have been ephemeral. We have had short-lived spray and pray strategies rather than long-lived pick and stick industrial strategies, which is why the government's green paper, when it was published last year on industrial strategy, seemed to signal a welcome break from the past. One, in putting this in legislation to ensure a degree of longevity. And second, in picking and hopefully sticking with 8 sectors behind which they would get. I mention a few of them here. The question I ask, the question I put to the room is, what do we make of that? Is 8 too many? Feels too many, right? Can you spread yourself really across 8 sectors at scale? Bear in mind that the countries that do this most successfully, I think something like Singapore, tend to pick and stick on one sector in 5-year blocks. But through a different lens, perhaps this is too narrow. If you look across the UK, you will find that even those 8 sectors comprise only 10, 15, 20% of the workforce in the vast majority of regions outside of London and the southeast. So as a case in point, you just flip on one more slide for me. Just one place, East Midlands, happen to be working with East Midlands at the moment. This is just a picture of employment in the East Midlands, not unrepresentative of much of the UK. The green blobs here are the identified superstar sectors from the government's green paper. They account for about 15% of the workforce. The biggies, as you might expect, education, retail, health, and a few others. One slide back if you could for me. In other words, the risk in this is casting the net too wide. What is the offering for that 85% of people in these Midlands and elsewhere? What is the opportunity escalator for them? If that is the fulcrum, the foundation of a growth strategy, is it truly inclusive along the sectoral, spatial, or socioeconomic dimension? Most likely it is not. So if not this, then what? 2 slides on, please. Well, the Chancellor says that a favourite economist on this is Danny Roderick, and he's done fantastic work on industrial strategy. But the paper I would ask all of the Treasury to focus on among his set of papers is this one I mentioned here, an industrial policy for good jobs. That is to say, an industrial strategy that begins from the skills and jobs upwards rather than the sectors downwards. For me, if industrial strategy is to be properly inclusive, it needs to comprise both elements. Of course, you should win your sectoral winners, play to your comparative strengths. But equally, what is the offering to lift the lives of those in the sectors not covered by those 8, which is the majority of what's sometimes called the foundational or the everyday economy, in health, in social care, in retail, in construction, in hospitality, and in the like. Well, the good news is there is a way of joining the top down and the bottom up together. It's one we're pursuing in the East Midlands, and Mark is here as part of my team working on this. It starts by identifying what are the skills of the workforce in place. What are the sectors and jobs of tomorrow that those workers could plausibly grow into as they rise along the opportunity escalator? And what then is the training and learning infrastructure needed to enable that jobs transition up the opportunity escalator? These are all propositions that are amenable to analysis. Next slide, please. I will not describe this chart, largely because I can't. But what it does give a sense of is the jobs and skills of everyone in East Midlands, how they can be divided up, how you might begin to piece together jobs journeys or skills transitions for everyone in that region, to locate them on the opportunity escalator and to provide the skills and training they need to rise along that opportunity escalator, so that jobs and growth are genuinely inclusive for everyone. Joining together the bottom-up skills analysis with a top-down sectoral analysis in crafting a local growth plan that works for everyone. And my message to government is that it's not too late to reconsider your own industrial strategy so that it has this inclusive, bottom-up, jobs and skills rich element to it, without which inclusive growth will not come to pass. Next slide, please. Second element is around governance, in particular at the local level. We all know, don't we, that the UK is among, if not the most disparate, regionally disparate of the nations in the Western world when it comes to outcomes. We also know that the UK is the most centralised of the nation states, and those two things are not coincidental. Those two things are two sides of the same coin. They reflect our unwillingness or inability to unlock the potential in place because we're unwilling to let go of powers and monies to local leaders to make good on those opportunities. And the brutal truth is this, the arithmetic truth is this. This government, no government, has any hope of meeting its national growth mission unless we make good on successful local growth missions. You know, a growth strategy that's about growing life sciences in Cambridge with imported skilled labour will not an inclusive. I'm not saying you're supporting this, Gillian. If you are, it'd be interesting. And right now, we do not have plausible plans for local growth, the length and breadth of the country. There has been progress, both under previous governments and indeed under this one, in endowing more powers on local leaders. And we saw that step up a further gear when this government published its white paper on devolution at the end of last year. That aimed to complete the map of devolution in England. It conferred some extra powers on local leaders, and it signalled the move towards a single financial settlement for local leaders in the fullness of time. Those are all directionally sensible measures. They are a nudging out of the devolution boat, but are they, in the terms used by the government, the devolution revolution taking hold? Well, they are no such thing. Even if all of those measures were to be put in place tomorrow, that would still leave the UK as the most centralised nation state in the Western world. When it comes to spending powers, it remains the case that the conferring of those is slow-moving and staggered, with regions put into fast, medium and slow lanes. There was no attempt to confer any fiscal powers, any tax-raising powers on any part of England. There's big questions about, even with a single financial settlement, is that of a scale that can back up a plausible local growth plan? The more you read of that white paper, the less it feels like true full-throated devolution, and more like decentralization. In other words, local leaders as the delivery arm of central missions, rather than genuine masters of their own destiny. So devolution, revolution, I don't think so. This feels like half a loaf, no fiscal powers, half-baked even spending powers are being given grudgingly and slowly. What might be done differently? Next slide, please. Well, in some ways, the answer, or part of it, is sitting under our noses. Before they came to power, Gordon Brown did a report for Kia on how this might be done. Some key elements of which have not been done. Let me flag one or two of them. First, I thought one of the key insights in Gordon's report was the flipping of the power presumption when it comes to spending. That is to say, rather than local leaders being handed a fixed menu of gifts from Whitehall, it's they that choose. They answer the question, what powers do we need to make good on our local plan? Rather than what powers is Whitehall willing to offer us to help make good on that plan. Flipping the presumption is, I think, essential if those local growth plans are to have any hope of being made good on. That's true with knobs on when it comes to the question of fiscal powers, of taxation powers. Why not enable some degree of experimentation when it comes to local tax raising powers? I give some examples here of how that might be done. When it comes to accountability, because with increased powers should come increased accountability. Gordon spoke of the need for local citizen-led accountability bodies, if you like, citizens' assemblies. No sign of that yet having happened. And of course, among the most pressing constraint facing many local leaders right now is just that after 20 years of hollowing out of local government, they don't possess the capacity and capability to make good on their plans. That is also a hole that could and probably should be filled. If those local growth plans are to have any hope of being fulfilled, and therefore if the national growth mission is to have any hope of being fulfilled. Next slide, please. Final bit, and this is, I've done industrial strategy, I've done governance and devolution. The final bit is the institutional ecology that supports policy in its many and various ways. Let me say a bit about fiscal institutions and frameworks, a bit about financial infrastructure institutions, a bit about learning institutions, innovation institutions, social institutions, and I'll definitely stop, Gillian, at that point. On fiscal, I've written bits and bobs on this, but the fiscal system we've set up is set up for failure. It's set up for growth failure along many dimensions. One, the much heralded fiscal rules. There's a step forward in last year's budget, but they're still too narrow and too rigid to make good on that big investment and capital stock deficit I mentioned earlier on, with too little focus on those crucial illiquid assets that we are criminally short of right now, including on our railways, Gillian. The fiscal framework within which these rules sit is itself far too knee-jerk, reflexive, and rigid. And that is leading to endless and needless speculation about fiscal policy adjustments on an almost daily, if not weekly basis, which is not good for stability, not good for confidence, and not good for growth. We need to build into our fiscal framework more tolerance for news, good or bad, without that necessitating a knee-jerk fiscal response. When she came in, the new Chancellor hardwired the OBR, the Office of Budget Reform, even more into this fiscal framework, to the point now that it's pretty much them that are judge, jury, and executioner on fiscal policy. That's not a role I'm sure they especially like, and it's not a role I think that's especially healthy in a democracy. Their role could easily, as is true of other arm's length bodies, be more advisory and looser. And finally, and perhaps most dramatically of all from an institutional perspective, I think now is the time, if ever there were one, for us to unburden my friends across the road in their responsibility for juggling both fiscal policy and the growth agenda. I think, like many other countries around the world, a separate economy ministry is needed to prevent the fiscal first instincts, understandable fiscal first instincts of Treasury officials trampling the growth agenda underfoot. Next slide, please. Financial. How long have I got, by the way? Are you timekeeping, having turned up late?
Keeping you quarter past one right now.
How long have I got, Gillian?
Can we push it until 2 o'clock if we wanted to finish about this? I'd say another 5 to 10 minutes.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're obviously hanging on your every word, but...
Are you listening, by the way?
I am listening very carefully. I'm actually looking
on
at
your phone.
Slides. I can't get onto the Wi-Fi. I'm looking at the slides on my phone.
Very good. Financial. I may skip some of these, but financial, an important one. A problem of long-standing. We know that the UK has a scale-up problem. We do startups well, we do scale-ups far less well. And one of the reasons for that is absence of access to scale-up finance. This is not a new problem. It was spoken about eloquently and in real detail in a commission, the Macmillan Commission of 1929. You read that today, little has changed. Only the date has changed. The problem remains as acute as then. Some fantastic work that Phil McCann and colleagues have done recently, just looking at the borrowing costs differences across different parts of the UK, right? Otherwise identical assets carry radically different borrowing costs in different parts of the UK. And those differences across the UK are more acute, the differences between Germany and Romania when it comes to borrowing costs. So contrary to popular belief, the UK is not a single market, right? We left one, but we aren't one right now. That's emblematic of acute differences in access to finance in companies in different parts of the UK. Efforts have been made. I mentioned some here, British Business Bank, National Wealth Fund most recently, lots of talk of pension fund reform. Directionally, that is all very sensible. Is it of the scale? Is it the system shift we need to plug those Macmillan gaps? Well, I'm the sceptical side of neutral, in part for questions of localism. The gaps are local. These institutions often operate centrally. In part for reasons of speed. We've been at pension reform for many years now, and it has not moved at the speed of light. I think you'll have spotted. And thirdly, and in some ways most importantly of all, do we have the risk tolerance? Given that both the BBB and the National Wealth Fund are backed by Treasury bucks, and given that pension fund trustees are chronically risk averse, will they put that money to work in closing those risk premium gaps between different parts of the UK and therefore closing those Macmillan gaps? I suspect my answer to that question is that I am unconvinced and that something more muscular by way of reform might be needed, mirroring this thing I mentioned here back in 1945 at another time of great renewal. The Industrial and Commercial Finance Corporation, initiated by my former employees at the Bank of England, was basically invite pension funds and banks into a room, lock the door, no one's leaving till you've all stumped up to finance the renewal of Britain. I'm not suggesting we lock the door, but there's ways of doing this that I think the time may have come. Next slide, please. Let me skip that one. I might come back to what I might do to reconfigure the higher education sector,
Okay.
Gillian, which is radically in
me.
need as
Exactly.
someone running a Cambridge college. You'll be fine, but everyone else needs to pull the socks up.
Okay.
Both HE and FE, further education, which is the collapsed left lung of our education system, needs vitally to be revitalised and configured to work with those local growth plans. Innovation, I mentioned startups we do well, scale-ups we do badly. And it's also true that innovation we do well, diffusion of innovation we do very badly. that in some ways they are mirror images of the self-same problem. That's why it is the case that actually our very best companies are the very best companies in the world. That top 10% outperform in productivity terms the top 10% in the US, in Germany, and in France. So how can it be then, Andy, you ask yourselves, that we have a productivity gap with those countries? And that's because we have a long, lower tail of businesses that are stuck in the mud in productivity terms. Innovation without diffusion. R&D, we do the R brilliantly and the D disastrously. What might be done? Well, going back almost 15 years now, Hermann Hauser brought the German Fraunhofer to the UK in the set of catapult centres, 9 of them across 65 locations. Now is the point to ask whether they're doing sufficient to boost innovation, and in particular to boost diffusion in this country in a way that supports local growth and industrial strategies. Plainly, they are not. I would reconfigure them and grow them in scale so that they can do the job both of pushing the frontier of innovation and, as importantly, supporting the diffusion of that innovation to the long tail of SMEs that are currently stuck in the mud in productivity terms. Next slide, please. I'm almost there. The social, often forgotten, social dimension of the ecology of our institutions and infrastructures. It is the case that alongside those years of underinvestment in our physical infrastructure and our human capital and our digital infrastructure, the biggest underinvestment of all has been in our social infrastructures. The parks, the playgrounds, the museums, the theatres, the youth clubs, the football clubs, the leisure centres, and the like. The things that people locally have pride in. They create that sense of belonging, that sense of connection, that sense of security. And we have systematically and comprehensively underinvested in those things over many years. The reason we know that is because metrics of social capital tell us that is the case. Occasionally it pops out in the form of the riots that took place last summer. The evidence now, the evidence on human capital and physical capital has been overwhelming for yonks. The evidence on the importance of social capital now is in some ways even more compelling. If you are to have any hope of climbing aboard the opportunity escalator, then nurturing your social capital is the single best way of doing so. If you're an individual, if you are a community, or if you are a nation state. And yet, as an issue, this has been a policy orphan across Whitehall. Who's in charge of social capital and social infrastructure in the government? Everyone, and therefore no one. Has fallen between the cracks, and we need a systematic program of reinvesting in that if we are to grow the lives of individuals, the fortunes of communities, and the GDP of the country. Next slide, please. Just to bring that point home. Remember before, what seems like a lifetime ago, I showed that map of economic mobility. That's now shown on the right, where warmer colours mean regress when it comes to social mobility. I put that alongside a measure here of economic connectedness, in this case between rich and poor. And what this makes clear is the very striking correlation between the two. It is who you know, every bit as much or more as what you know, that determines your chances of getting ahead, of improving your life generationally. Last slide. I've definitely finished. This government, previous governments, do not have a story and do not have a strategy for growth. Full stop. Certainly not inclusive growth. I'm going to sketch what I hope are some of the contours of changing that. built around inclusive jobs, industrial strategies, inclusive local governance, and inclusive institutions. That would be a system reconfiguration. That would require a scale of effort we found it difficult to summon in the past. But if at this point of a mass geopolitical reset, we cannot do it, then when can we do it? Thanks everyone for listening.
Well, that was wonderful. I'm not sure, is this working? Great. That was absolutely wonderful and magisterial, as I would have expected, Andy, and very comprehensive. And my first thought in looking at this was that the charts and the data points that you've assembled are absolutely shocking, very depressing, and hopefully very galvanizing. And I think they're not widely appreciated at all. People know vaguely that the UK has stalled growth-wise in the last few years. I can tell you that having been out of the UK for the last 12 years, based in America, I came back last year to, as Andy says, be Provost at King's College, Cambridge, and was truly shocked by how stagnant things felt. I mean, really shocked. If you're out of the country for 12 years, it's pretty shocking to come back here right now. But I've never seen these data points that you've laid out so well, and I think they are extremely powerful. I very much hope that you turn this into a book, Andy, or a pamphlet. He and I have been arguing for years about his inability to produce books, and he should produce a book now on this straight away.
Not happening.
Why not?
You write it, I'll stick my name on it.
Okay, deal.
Joint book.
Okay, deal. But seriously, deal. But you need to get this out, Andy, because pamphlets are powerful. You need to get it out in a pamphlet. You need to get it out not just in op-eds, but more significantly. But I have two questions I want to ask you before I toss it widely. The first is, you mentioned Singapore as one place that has very good industrial strategy. I've spent quite a bit of time with the Singaporean leaders in the last few months talking about these kind of things, and they do indeed think about industrial policy in a way that is far-sighted. However, they're also ultra-centralized. So the questions I have to you is, one, are there countries aside from Singapore that you would emulate and that we can learn from? And two, does this have to involve, what you seem to be arguing, significant devolution? Or can you actually do this through a centralized top-down model? And which would you prefer? Because you seem to be calling for something more akin to the federal structure in the US, or something like Switzerland, which frankly I think is probably one of the most functioning, effective democracies in the world right now. Is that what you're aiming for, a Switzerland or a US federal structure? Or do you think centralization can actually deliver the type of far-sighted industrial policy we're talking about? Or are we just too darn big for that? And then I have one more question before I toss it open.
Should I have a little go at that one first?
Yeah, please.
I mean, you're right. We couldn't and wouldn't want to replicate the Singaporean model for all sorts of governance and centralization reasons. Although the spirit of the way they've gone about it, we absolutely can replicate, which is commit to it over a long time horizon, build the pipeline of personnel as well as the businesses, seek inspiration from elsewhere around the world, something we're singly bad at in the UK actually, and go at it at scale as well as with duration. We can replicate those features. In its heyday, Germany had those features as well. And that might be a more appropriate governance model.
As more appropriate size as well.
A more appropriate size. And of course, they've had a roadblock because they made some bad bets on a few things, not least on energy. But the infrastructure there and institutions, financial and fiscal, and skills, have been a driver of their growth engine. We do not have the same engines in place right now. I think the question we need to ask, on your question about appropriate degrees of devolution and decentralization, for me, a fully effective growth or industrial strategy will have a spatial dimension, what's done locally. It will have a sectoral dimension, where do we place our bets? But it will have some horizontal dimension. What is it that only central government can do? But that's the right way to cast the question, rather than central government doing everything and the rest being on the fringes. And that's a debate we now need, I think, as a nation to have, which is what would be better devolved. But the truth is, one of the problems with any growth strategy is a multiple ingredients. Baking, growing an economy is the same as baking a cake, right? So you need multiple ingredients put together at the right time. One of the problems national government has is to do that, you require overt cross-Whitehall coordination, because they each have different ingredients. That degree of cake baking is much easier locally, where you can coordinate the arms, than it is nationally. And that's among the reasons why we need to go much further on the federalisation of decision making.
Right. Well, that leads me to my second question before I cast it open, which is that I, perhaps like many people, was quite disappointed by the opening months of the new government, because, they appeared to have got into power and then acted like deer in the headlights without a clear-cut vision of plan or the ability to actually execute, which, perhaps is understandable, but I say was very disappointing. You have been tactful in how you've presented this, in the sense that you haven't directly said that they don't really have much of a plan and they're fluffing whatever plan they do have. But, as a journalist, that appears to be very much the situation at the moment. So my question is, do you have any hope that anybody in Labour is actually going to listen to this and has the ability to actually execute on it? Because it's not just about ideas at this point, it's about execution as well. And do you see any sign that they're moving towards doing that? And do you have much hope that the Trump shock will actually provide the convenient excuse for them to actually rally together and do something?
Very good. I've written down tactful, not been called tactful before, actually. So
I was trying to flatter you, Andy. It probably won't work.
Add that to the CV. Yes, I am. I'm actually I'm optimistic on both fronts. So it is the case, and it was puzzling how little was there by way of plan, not just in economics, but across a number of the portfolios. I think that's a fairly open secret now. I've puzzled, as I imagine many others in the room, as to how that could be. Come across the Dunning-Kruger effect. Dunning-Kruger effect, where basically you don't know what you don't know. That's what Dunning-Kruger. Sometimes when you really don't know what you're doing, you think you do know what you're doing, until you know a little bit when you realise you don't know anything.
Yeah, story of my life.
So I think it's not that they said they had a plan and knew they didn't. I think they thought they had a plan, but it didn't. It evaporated on impact with fresh air, given the scale of the challenge. And since then, it's been a case of playing catch-up. But there's obviously a desire to play catch-up, given the way they've set up their stall on their emissions. And I would hope and probably expect there's a degree of listening as to what might be done differently to avoid what I think have been a sequence of rookie errors so far, not just on the economics front, but more generally. Do I think that matters across the pond could be a galvanizing force for the UK and indeed for Europe generally? I would say yes. In a way, the government have been handed an economic and security strategy on a platter. And defence absolutely could be the fulcrum and foundation stone of the industrial strategy I mentioned earlier on. That no one would choose defence if the world were not as the world is. But let's turn that necessity into a virtue. And one of the benefits of defence actually is it straddles the skills space from very high-end, white-collar AI innovation right through to blue-collar, grey metal bashing. It straddles all four corners of the UK, so it meets the mark sectorally, spatially, and socio-economically. What's not to to like. And among my disappointments with the spring statement last week is that could have been used as a big reset moment in this new, more insecure world, and turning that, as I say, that necessity into the virtue of that being our packaged, ready-made jobs, growth and skill strategy for the UK. That has not yet happened, but I live in hope and perhaps even expectation, Gillian, that might.
Well, let's hope so. Sorry, one other very quick question on that point before we turn to Keith Raffan, who's answering a question online. What should Cambridge do? If you're in my shoes, what would you be doing right now to try to, implement some of this or support some of this?
University?
Yeah.
Well, one of the things, in some ways, you mentioned you were shocked in coming back to the UK. That that's not true, of course, of Cambridge, which is the land of milk and honey in a great many respects. Except if you came to inclusive growth in Cambridge has not been inclusive.
Yeah, and also we have trains that break down, and we can't grow rapidly enough, because we can't build enough housing. We can't build enough housing because there's not enough water.
Yeah.
And the idea of not having enough water in a country where it rains the whole damn time is mind-boggling.
Yeah, it is. The seed corn of success is there, because there is no more fervent innovation hub in the UK than Cambridge. But it is a question of filling in those gaps, the ones you mentioned earlier on. Getting our arms around planning is part of that. A rather more front foot leadership from Cambridge and Peterborough wouldn't go amiss either. Inviting, attracting back kind of reverse brain, like yourself, into the country would be a thoroughly good thing. But I think that the big lesson for Cambridge is that you can't afford, for those who are outside the honeypot, to just suck it up.
Right. Yeah, sure. Please do. Do you want? It would be courteous but not compulsory to briefly identify yourself.
Yeah, I'm Paul Ormer. I chair the Rochdale Development Agency.
All right.
And a major economic development zone for Andy Burnham. But he signed a major deal with Cambridge and Peterborough.
Yeah.
Precisely to, if you like, spread technology. That's just for information, for Gillian's information. So there is something going on about this. Yeah. And also, Cambridge, the Vice-Chancellor came to Cambridge, and now we have a deal with Cambridge for academics to come to our secondary schools and inspire people. So things are going on.
Yeah, on that note, by the way, when we are, for what it's worth, King's College has an outreach project in Middlesbrough to try and get kids when they're young and train them up for higher education. And also a number of companies are actively trying to put, plants, production sites, in the north and elsewhere to try and spread the love, if you like. But a long way to go. I'm sure there are questions in the audience here. Should we take one and then go to Keith? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Joe Jervis. I run an initiative called Renaissance, and Renaissance focuses on the need for a manufacturing renaissance across the country, and also a renaissance of ideas within the Labour Party. We're connected to the Labour Party. So everything you just said, Andy, is on point in terms of where we are, so that's great to hear. I think my question really is around the parts of that plan which require central government investment, whether that's the social aspects at the end, whether it's catapult, whether it's investment in CapEx. There's obviously a lot of concern about cost of borrowing going up for any extra government borrowing that they do. So I just wondered if you'd be able to say a little bit about that. Is that a concern? Can that be mitigated by changing the fiscal rules? Are there ways that we can unlock private finance around the country without heavy state investment? So yeah, and I suppose attached to that, is there also an opportunity to do something in terms of increasing revenue into the Treasury by doing something around the kind of ideas that we're seeing around a wealth tax, or finding money from elsewhere in a way that wouldn't impact growth? Thank you.
Should we Lots in that. Let me pick up one or two bits of it. I'm all in on advanced manufacturing being the way forward. I would say that. One of my rather too many side hustles is I chair the Advanced Manufacturing Research Centre up in South Yorkshire, up in Sheffield, which does all the things I've just been talking about, really. I'm sure you know their site well. That ought to be, indeed is, the centrepiece of Love Coppard's growth plan for South Yorkshire, with loads of fantastic businesses on site, McLaren, Boeing, Rolls-Royce, an apprentice training centre, and with the necessary investment in housing, in transport, and in training, that could deliver all that we need for that region and others. So that is absolutely the way forward. How is that to be financed, I think, was the essence of your question. Plainly, that will require, given the scale of lift, some mix of public and private finance. I think the public part of that's important to de-risk the project up front and for some elements of it. When it comes to, I understand people's concerns about the perils of government bond markets right now. There's no question they are in a fragile state. But you must ask yourself the question, what is it that bond market vigilantes are really looking for right now? They want a home that's politically stable. We do okay on that front, actually. But the second thing is an economy that grows. Because an economy that grows is one that throws off tax revenues and pays down that debt. So I've long-standing been of the view that provided you accompany your borrowing with a credible growth story, bond markets suck it up. They even love it. And if you look at the international evidence on that, that bears that out, actually. There is no simple relationship between debt levels and borrowing levels. The real relationship is between the net worth of a nation and borrowing costs. If you borrow to invest and invest throws off growth tomorrow, you're rewarded with a lower borrowing cost, not a high one. So I think that part of this does lie with the public purse and a slightly more enlightened, longer-term view of how to manage it. But equally, crowding in private monies in many and various forms will be equally important, both domestically and overseas. A more muscular approach to our pension funds is part of the answer, and a more red carpet approach to our overseas foreign investors is also an important part of the package. And with that, there's no reason. I mean, the truth is, here's the perversity of it. The world's awash with money. There's loads of it, isn't there?
Just in the wrong places.
It's in the wrong places.
Yeah. We need to rechannel it. Can I just quickly check from the organisers, are we okay to go over by 10 minutes or so? We've got a question from Keith Raffan and David Goodhart.
Another 10 minutes?
Is that okay? All right.
Start.
If anyone needs to drift out, please do. But we got a question in the front I can see there. We've also got 2 questions online. So let me quickly get the questions online, then come to you. Keith Raffan, do you want to ask your question? I'm not quite sure how this works.
How important is the reset with the European Union, and how would you define that? For example, you mentioned the potential of the defence industry, but how is our defence industry going to gain access to the European market?
Okay, and shall we also take David Goodhart's question as well? So the first question is, how important is the European reset for Britain in terms of getting access to that? Will defence help or not? And then David Goodhart, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, hi, Andy. Hi, Gillian. Can you hear me?
We can.
We can.
Yeah. I was a bit surprised, Andy, you barely focused on planning reform, which tends to dominate most of the other accounts of why growth is so sluggish. You didn't really mention energy, our ridiculously high energy costs, partly thanks to the net zero rush, which is driving away industry. And industry, after all, it's easier to produce higher productivity in industry than it is in services. You didn't mention the overdependence on increasingly lower skilled immigration, which also tends to depress investment, and the fact that we are overtaxing the productive rich and arguably undertaxing the unproductive wealth and property in the country. I mean, it seems so frustrating. They had so much time to think through something like a land tax, It was clear for 18 months they were going to win the election, and they've come up with nothing original. But my sort of bigger worry is, a lot of the account sounds conventionally sort of social democratic, which is, which I would count myself as a social democrat. But part of me wonders whether actually the very phrase inclusive growth is a sort of contradiction in terms, actually, and that we need to kind of release the animal spirits, which in some ways means being uninclusive.
So do we need to reset with Europe? And do we need to rethink animal spirits and embrace what sounds to me like a bit of free market capitalism?
So to those 2 points, is European reset needed? Yes. And is the opportunity so to do? Yes, there is. In some ways, we're back there to the galvanizing effect of Trump. And the fraying, if not dismantling, of the Western alliance. And as we've seen already, that gives us real opportunities to find common cause with our partners in Europe around defence. They've been just a touch sniffy about that so far. But I think there's mutual benefits on both sides from joining hands on that front. And I hope that does happen as the first element in what I hope would be a pathway to greater joined upness than we've been able to achieve over the past few years. There was a whole bunch of things, David, I didn't mention, which I could have done, but didn't in the interest of time. When it comes to planning, every government I can remember in living memory has spoken about planning reform. And this one is as well. And it has bold plans on that front that the ABR are now even scoring. Miracles do happen, it seems. Occasionally. Will that be enough to make good on the 1.5 million new houses? I fear not, because you can have the best planning system in the world, but if you don't have enough planners and architects and brickies and sparkies and plumbers, those houses won't get built. Houses are built by people, not planning, and we're still chronically short people, despite the announcement last week of training of 60,000 new construction workers, which takes time.
Yeah.
Generational endeavour, skill building and skills where we're chronically short. On tax, there's all sorts of dimensions of policy which have not been thought about in expansive enough ways. The contours of tax are certainly among them. Our question earlier on was a bit about wealth taxes, pluses and minuses. The simplest and most effective way of going about that would be to look afresh at housing taxation as our single biggest source of wealth in this country. Council tax is ridiculously calibrated right now. A terribly regressive tax, out of date and out of touch. And looking at that afresh, either the recalibration of existing council tax or better still, thinking imaginatively about land value taxation, David, is absolutely the order of thinking we will need, maybe as soon as the budget later on this year, which it strikes me very likely will require us to return to the pump on the tax front.
Right. We've got a question at the front there. Oh, actually, it's actually behind. Okay, why don't you go first? You and then. In fact, let's take three. Will you, and then Paul, and then at the back, and then I think we'll have to start wrapping.
Thank you. My name's James Fierro. I'm with Eco Capacity Exchange. Was persuaded to come here by the UK government because we were driving an innovative enterprise around rethinking money, basically. Which brings me to, isn't that really the core problem? Money itself. We have been kind of nipping around the edges. We need to find ways of financing, whether it's the long tail or whether it's growth. And as you said, the world is awash in money, but it's not being deployed against the long tail. If you go and ask businesses, they all say the reason they're not achieving any growth is because they don't have the access to the capital to do the things that need to be done. So money is at the root cause of the problem, because what has happened, money's become an instrument of making money from money.
Okay.
And so alternatives. We started to. There's an initiative with
So
the UN.
keep your comment brief.
Okay.
Question very brief, because we've
What
got
is-
two other get in.
What is happening on alternatives around money?
Okay, so do we need to rethink money as part of rethinking development? Yes, Paul.
Can I just focus on innovation? Because this is actually a central plank in the Rochdale Development Agency strategy and more broadly across Greater Manchester. So you started off conventionally, Andy, with talking about physical and human capital. And of course, those are two of the elements in Solo's canonical theory of economic growth. But the third element, which he called technical progress, but which was the diffusion of better working practices, empirically in the developed economies, that's by far the most important element in economic growth. And I can't really believe that the government aren't paying attention to this enormous body of conclusive research, that diffusing innovation by getting existing firms to adopt better working practices, even at quite a low level, but the high value manufacturing catapults are grossly underfunded. We deal with them, they get 300 million a year in total.
Okay, so what about money? What about diffusion of technology, and why isn't that happening? That's your laggards and leaders work. Yeah.
Andy Forbes. I'm from I'm chief exec of the Lifelong Education Institute, and I'm still reeling from the fact that the slide on education went whizzing past before I could even see it.
And this is why he needs to write a book, so he can.
Yeah, he needs to write a book. But also, anyway. I spent a lot of my career in further education and was fascinated to hear it being described as the collapsed left lung of the education system. My question is, what is wrong with our education system? Is there any headline that you could share with us about education and skills?
Right. Three big questions.
Three massive questions. And
I noticed on the education side, you actually said quite specifically that what they'd said about it recently was pretty pathetic.
Well, this was the government's review of the curriculum. Yeah. I mean, prior to that, there was a review done last year on the future of the higher education sector, your sector.
Yep. Keenly aware of that.
Which was also rather damp. And I was part of that, so it's partly my fault, kind of mea culpa. On these questions, James, around money. We met in Bretton Woods, you mentioned earlier on. You were there as well, actually. Remember that?
Yeah.
Bretton Woods. The money is there, but is not being mobilised. And among the reason the money is not being mobilised is people are chronically risk averse right now. Not just those that have money, but it's true of businesses, it's true of governments, it's true of individuals. Psychologically scarred by the big nasties we've had over the last 15 years or so. So I think rather than this being seen to be an institutional answer, part of this is a cultural question of how we get people to break free in an uncertain world of the natural inclination to hunker down and hunker away. Back when this was last pervasive, which is back in the 30s, the kind of paradox of Thrift Keynes time, the answer came partly from government, that only they have the deep enough pockets and long enough horizons to bear that risk. I feel that's true today as well in terms of mobilising more private finance. On Paul and innovation, we fare poorly on R&D spend, as you say. Our catapults are about 10th the size they need to be, about 10th the size of the Fraunhofer on a GDP equivalent scale. They're in the innovation game, but not the diffusion game. Those are all known problems we could solve at relatively modest cost, Paul. That's the frustration of this, and I hope that we do get Foursquare behind them and do that. I think the payoffs would be considerable, and all the evidence speaks to the payoffs being very considerable, whether through the network of catapults or more broadly. And finally, on All Matters Education and Andy, and interestingly, forget the name of the institution, but lifelong learning was in it. Yes, lifelong education. I mean, it was progress from the last government that we started speaking about, indeed, creating a lifelong learning entitlement. Although, of course, it is an entitlement to a loan, which is a strange type of entitlement, that one.
Particularly given that 40% of the student loans are not being paid back or being defaulted on.
Quite so.
Which is, again, yet another shocking statistic in your report.
So, everyone is all for lifelong learning, which will need to actually make good on it. But right now, this has not been approached at the scale and with the system, to my point earlier on, to secure success. Just about one thing about our education system I would look at afresh. There's a long list of candidates, but let me give you one, which is to reconsider not just what we teach, but how we teach it. We now have within our grasp, for the first time in human history, the ability to personalize our learning to individuals' neurologies and circumstances. We can do that, but aren't yet doing it. We still have a largely chalk and talk, homogenous Victorian approach to teaching, which is why that third of kids end up leaving loathing rather than loving learning. That is within our technological compass. There are people on the planet doing just that. Why can't we beg, borrow, and steal their ideas to unlock the potential in all of our people? And to David's point, that is an inclusive growth agenda. That is providing the ladder, that is fueling those animal spirits, but in a way that works for everyone and not just for those for whom chalk and talk works.
I could not agree more. But, well, listen, it's been an absolutely fascinating presentation. I really would urge you all, if you've seen the slides, to delve into them, because the statistics and numbers and the charts inside them are truly astonishing. Whether it's the whole mapping of social mobility and the social connectedness, or some of the little nuggets about the degree to which the UK has declined relative to other Western countries so dramatically in the last couple of decades. So pretty depressing in many ways, but also very cheering in the sense that there are visions for how to try and tackle this and get things moving with a very different outcome. And let us just hope that, firstly, Andy does finally write his book and lay it out very clearly as a manifesto. And secondly, that the government actually listens. And thirdly, that we do actually find the ability in this country to respond to the shock, to not merely galvanize around a mission, but actually discover our execution capabilities, because that is as critical as anything else. So, big round of applause for Andy, and thank you all for listening.